you'd whip out these big process maps and they'd look at it and you'd just see their eyes glaze over and they go, oh, what am I doing here? Big lesson in that is to start to write things in languages of the audience in which you're writing it in so they can understand.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers, and in each of these episodes, we get the absolute privilege to sit down with process practitioners, those that are putting the art of business process management into practice in organizations on a day-to-day basis and delivering real tangible value. And that's really where this series came from a number of conversations I was having with the various individuals that were asking me that question, what does it take to create sustainable BPM that delivers value, not just on a once-off, but on a continuous life cycle, helping to deliver that constant value to an organization. So that's why I sit down with various specialists and practitioners that are where we all want to be. So in today's episode, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Ben Donnelly Aquilina. Now, Ben is a business process excellence lead at Lion and has worked in some of Australia's largest organisations. So definitely has been on the cutting edge of what it looks like to implement BPM into an organisation and to see it be sustainable. So we're going to dive into many different areas and topics in today's conversation. Ben, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So that was obviously a very brief introduction to yourself. And I think one thing that the audience would love to hear and love to find out is how were you introduced to this topic of business process management?
Definitely by happy accident, I think would be the best way to describe it. I did not leave uni intending to sort of jump directly into the business process management space. I'm sure that's probably a pretty common theme out there, but it just sort of happened to be to land in my lap, I'd say. Actually started life as a graduate engineer, background in mechatronics and biomedical engineering. Wanted to build an Iron Man suit was kind of the dream. And I think I graduated pre the first Iron Man movie, so it was quite nerdy of me. That was basically my introduction to the continuous improvement business process management side of things, was when I first started with my first career, Transport for New South Wales. I was a graduate there, and effectively what they did is they put you on a rotation. And one of the rotations was actually my first rotation prior to graduating was a continuous improvement rotation, which when I first heard those words, continuous improvement, and I was a graduate engineer who never really studied it, heard of it, or understood what it was. I thought it was a bunch of people who probably stood in front of a mirror and, tried to, make themselves look a bit better and continuously improve how beautiful they were. But no, I ended up actually sticking in that rotation for, I think it was about a year and a half. Wow. That was really sort of a very strong introduction to what was more the world of Lean Six Sigma at the time. Right. So I went through my training in that. I think they went whites, yellows, greens, and lean leader, I think I did in that space, that a specialised sort of lean leader space. So process improvement was really what we focused on in the transport, across that transport network. So that was sort of it, my first foray into the world of processes, but more process improvement side of things. Mm-hmm. The first foray into sort of process management came when I actually left my graduate rotation and went to a Canadian aerospace company. They built aircraft simulators, really cool. Was able to have some fun on a couple of aircraft simulators on my lunchtime and fly them all around Sydney. And I think it was Boeing 777s and a few other bits and pieces. So that was a lot of fun and really cool at the time. But I guess I was there and brought across as a continuous improvement specialist. Based on sort of my learning and background at transport. But really one of the big focuses was on more of the process management side of things and the actual maintaining and managing and governing processes. The reason being, and it's quite powerful when an organisation requires you to do process management. The reason being is they had to be CMMI certified based on some of their contracts. So capability modelling maturity index, I think I can't remember what it actually sort of stands for. But the CMMI certification effectively forced them to have a very strong and mature level of process standardization and requiring that as well. And it was very much sort of requirements-driven process management style when we first entered in there. And part of what I did with one of my partners in the organisation actually was to sort of start to balance out some of the real compliance-driven process management, which was all about documentation, checkboxing, auditing, and alignment to process, through to the performance side of things. So I was able to bring on some of my kind of lean experience and process improvement and really think about not just do we have these processes documented, are people following in these processes, but how do we really get the most effective and efficient processes out of it? Right. I was very fortunate in that it was an organisation that allowed me to experiment with different techniques, experiment with different pieces of software, experiment with change management practices and principles, and because it was a bit more of a smaller, more nimble space, it allowed me to very much do that without too much consequence in that. So it was quite powerful and just a learning mechanism. And I think we all know that in the Lean Six Sigma space, it's all about experimental learning. So that was quite powerful. Really good example was just being able to shift some of the it sounds really boring, but shift some of the documentation away from these documents that were written with an analyst in mind, and the audience being someone who was quite technically savvy, someone who had knowledge of business process management, to shifting it to be much more focused around the people actually using the process and working in the process, and that end sort of consumer space. We did a lot of sort of experimenting in sort of formats and even just formats and layouts and the ability to kind of get people to start to build their own process in that space. I did have a lot of learnings, and one of the big things was basically we started off with going, everyone's got to sort of build their own process. And the reality is it's beautiful in saying everyone needs to build their own sort of process and you provide them a software and a system to do it. But if it's not fundamentally part of their job or their core drivers or ambition, they kind of go, yeah, I'll get it done, but it's very much a side project or a nice to have. Or you get a couple that are engaged, but you never really get them on board. So I kind of say you got to take them 80% of the way. Yeah, you got to kind of take them 80% of the way there. We effectively basically wrote out the skeletons, and then it's all about sitting down and working with them to build it. And then they started to feel like they were part of it, in terms of part of building what the process was and what the process looked like. That was really powerful. And at the same time, I also learned that the act in doing that isn't just a documentation exercise. The act in doing so is a significant amount of sort of learning, self-reflection, and that's where you find some of those real gems of process improvement. It facilitates some really strong discussions around, why do you actually do it this way? The pretty obvious things. Why do you do it this way? What value do you think that adds? Do you have a good feedback loop that actually tells you if this process is working or not? So that in itself was a good learning, because it was very powerful to just have those conversations in the first place in an organisation in which the documentation, everything's very much driven from people sitting at a desk writing, this is how we should do it, and then going out and sort of auditing it perspective to a business owning it, as sort of a balance between the business owning it and the process management practitioners owning it. So that was sort of a really cool time in my career where I got to experiment a little bit more. So we set up some continuous improvement programs on some of the sites, on some of the simulator sites as well. So process improvement, business process management, always side by side, like I think they have to be. And then, fortunately, I got jumped across into Woolworths, so quite a significant organisation there. Big difference. And that's sort of where I really jumped into managing people in that space, managing a larger team of business process management practitioners. Very different because it is such a large organisation. You write a process. There are lots and lots of employees who then must need to follow that process, and therefore you have to sort of take a slightly different approach to what you did previously. So Woolworths itself was more a career development thing for me in terms of learning to manage a team of people rather than directly going out and doing it myself in that space. And yeah, I think in that was also one of the things that when we turned up to Woolies when I turned up to Woolies once again, and this was more focused in the supply chain space, the process management system was a very robust process management tool. However, it was only accessible by those experts and those people who are very much trained in process management. And by accessible, I don't just mean able to physically access, but accessible, I mean when we were having design consultations or process improvement consultations with people in the business, and you'd whip out these big process maps, and they'd look at it, and you'd just see their eyes glaze over, and they go, "Oh, what am I doing here?"
Yeah, right.
Big lesson in that is to start to write things in languages of the audience in which you're writing it in, so they can understand. I think we always underestimate how intimidating some of these big, 25-page process maps can be. I think people tend to feel that they're adding value as process management practitioners by writing these massively complicated, 6-meter-long process maps, and they go, "Look how much value I've added." But at the end of the day, the only one who's going to use that is the person who built it or the person who wrote it, which doesn't really make sense to me. So that's a really sort of key lesson in that. And as an engineer, I was definitely leaning that way in terms of I saw the value in making things complicated. I saw the value in making things technically correct. And I think that's something that I had to sort of pull back and put my human change management lens over the top and say, in reality, what's this being used for? And if it's not being used for a systems architecture, which requires that very technical, complex, detailed step-by-step, if it's being used for a process improvement or a management decision, there's a different mechanism and a way in which you must build, design, and present those processes. So that was just a massive learning in that space, and even down to how do you then extract things like standard operating procedures and all that out of these documents. They need to be usable and used, and that was kind of a key ambition in any process management is how many people are actually reading this damn thing, or how many people is this providing clarity to? Is the practice following the process? And if not, is it because the process isn't accessible or not? So that was sort of that was, I guess, some of my time at Woolies. We embedded a sort of a new framework, a new business process management framework across. Initially, we sort of started with supply chain, and then it got picked up by other parts of the business in that space. I ended my time with Woolies in the Big W turnaround space, so which was once again just eye-opening in how process can drive turnaround, which I think is something I'll probably touch on a little later in that space. And now across at Line, very much on the beginning of the process journey for me there. So still fresh there and getting my toes wet. Testing a lot of the beautiful product, I guess, at that stage. But still sort of very much understanding where we need to go and what we need to do and how we mature process in that space.
Yeah, great. No, that's fantastic. The best introduction I would say we've had in the series so far. We could probably end the podcast right there. I think I took so much from that brief history of the journey that you've been on so far. So would you say that most of those organisations that you've been involved in, BPM was widely understood and adopted, and it did make it easier to test and trial and error and things like that? Or?
I'd say no.
Yeah, okay.
would be the short answer. I think there was very much a misunderstanding. There is in most organisations that have a sort of a lower maturity in this space, and it's almost an indication of low maturity if they don't understand what process management is. In a way, I think we all get really frustrated when we have sort of a very unstructured, low maturity or in an unstructured, low maturity space. That's kind of because people have never really valued or understood process and what it can do and what it actually means. I think in your first ever podcast, Ant mentioned making process sexy again, and Ant and I did work together at Woolies, so that's kind of where some of that stems from and those conversations. It is we need to acknowledge, and the elephant in the room is that process is a dirty word to quite a few people. Even sitting in agile training, there's process versus relationships. And they always talk about balancing process versus relationships, or I think the words are relationships over process in that space. Very important to understand that when they are talking about that in agile space, it doesn't necessarily mean throw out your processes. And I think there's kind of a misunderstanding that process ruins creativity and all that kind of stuff. But I kind of like to beg the differ in that space. I think when I first entered the aircraft simulator company, I was introduced to one of the older gentlemen there and very much old school engineer. And basically I was introduced as, this is the guy who's going to come and look and help us fix our processes. And he turned around to me and said, "Oh, that's okay. I won't be working with you much then because I don't use processes." And to me, I was like, it just kind of baffled me because I'm like, hang on, but a process is basically just what you do. It's a way in which you do things. So you're saying that you don't do work? I don't know. It really confused me. But I think it was a lack of understanding as to what actually is a process. I think people see processes I think what he actually meant when he said I don't use processes is I don't sit there and read the documentation, which is a complete sort of misunderstanding of what it is. I think a lot of people have also been really burnt in the past with these massive process documentation exercises, which some, as I said, do add significant value because it's the art of sitting down and working through the process that actually creates a lot of those fantastic insights. But they sort of see it as nothing of value really came out of that. We've got this massive list of 300, 400, 500 processes that we spent wages and wages and wages documenting that don't actually make any sense anymore. So why would I bother doing that again? And that's the case in most organizations I've been in at the start. So building a business case to do process management is often quite hard when they've been burnt like that in the past, and it's just been this big process documentation exercise that they saw didn't actually add too much value to that space. So I'd probably say if you are leaning on doing this big process documentation exercise, really understand the reasoning why you're doing it. If you're in an organization that is small and agile, sometimes it can actually be a bit stifling, if we're really honest. It is to sit down and go through. It's great, the great exercise to actually go through and do it, but it can be a little bit stifling if you're in a team of 3 or 4 and you build your product, you deliver your service through the relationships between 3 or 4 people. Sometimes there isn't a really strict maturity needed. You need to basically understand what are the key milestones you need to hit in that process. So what are the key business rules under which you're going to operate? What are the key milestones in which you're going to hit? But having every step by step detail documented down can be a little bit stifling. On the other hand, if you're in an organisation like coming from Woolworths, where I'll probably use Big W as an example, 16,000 team members, you want to make sure that there is really strong consistency of delivery. And that's for the sake of the customer as well as the people working in the process. Very strong clarity around who in the store is filling the shelves, who in the store is on the what are they doing in the checkouts, where are those boundaries between where they work, making sure that there is a consistent level of delivery for the customer, because it's that variation that causes the pain, not average. That's probably one of my favourite sayings in anything. I'm standing in a bucket of ice and my head is on fire. By law of averages, I'm doing fine. So one of the really big things was, creating some very strong, robust clarity around this. Who does what is very important when you're in an organisation that needs to deliver that high level of standards and service excellence and consistency around that. On the other end of the spectrum, sometimes it can be a bit stifling for people who are in a team of 2 or 3 and a very high-performing team who are very clear around what they're going to deliver. That's just something to be conscious of. And then you got a team of 3 or 4 and you got this, young whippersnapper coming in and going, we need to document their processes. Straight away, they're going to go, we don't really see the value in that. So you got to be clear around why you're doing it. I think for those smaller teams, it's more around improvement and strategy than it is around documentation and clarity. So it's more around understanding where are some of the pain points, using it as a process improvement tool, rather than using it as rather than using it effectively like a standard operating procedure type tool. So that use is and the audience that you're using it for is very important to understand. So lean towards the process improvement with the smaller, more nimble. Lean towards the standardization with some of the larger ones in which standardization itself is a process improvement.
Yeah, great. That's fantastic. And what would you say, you've already suggested a number of motivations or reasons for adopting process management. I guess from an enterprise-wide, an organisation level, driven from the top down, what would you say are the biggest drivers for an organisation that might be doing process in pockets of the organisation, and they switch from that to saying, we need to do this enterprise-wide. We need to understand our cross-functional value chains better than we currently do. What are those key drivers, those key motivators that you're aware of or you've come across?
I think there's probably two main themes. One is very much around clarity and ownership, and the other theme is very much around insights and improvement. So I've just kind of hinted on them before. Clarity and ownership itself can be an improvement, because often a process actually fails because there's no clear ownership in terms of who does what.
Right.
It's pretty simple. When something comes along, when something comes along that people don't really understand where that handover is, that's where whatever it is kind of gets left by the wayside or forgotten about or not done. So that clarity and ownership is very much important. I think the clarity and ownership also builds accountability. A story from retail was very common theme was you would go into and this is kind of an indication of some immaturity, pockets of immaturity. It doesn't happen everywhere, but you go into a store and they'd say, I'm going to make up a name. This is Bob. Bob runs this section of the store, and Bob runs this section of the store absolutely beautifully. He comes in 3 days a week, and this is what he does. And you go, okay, cool. It looks pretty schmick. What he's done looks pretty good. It's clean. It's in control. But then you go back 2 weeks later, and Bob's been on leave for a week, or he's been sick for a week. And effectively that part of the store has, for lack of a better term, gone to crap. But that is an indication, although Bob is very good at what he does, it's an indication that the process itself is actually inherently immature in that space. So there's no real clarity because the customer's not walking through Bob's section is not going to know that Bob's not in. At the end of the day, the customer doesn't care that Bob's not in. The customer just cares that their product's not there or that section of the store doesn't look that good. So that clarity and ownership piece is very much important in driving the overall maturity of the process and providing a level of expectation and standards that you do want to deliver. And it very much makes it clear to everyone in the organisation, this is the expectation and standards to which we deliver and to how we operate. It also helps you sort of understand some of the complexities in some of those channels as well. The other side is sort of some of the insights and improvements side of things as well. So if your business is always talking about, okay, we need to standardize, standardize isn't make everyone do the same thing. And that is about providing clarity and ownership and clear expectation. That, to me, is standardization. It's not, I have to do the same thing all the time. It's clarity and ownership and clear expectation on that. That's a big part of any large organization who delivers to multiple customers across multiple channels or, in my case, stores. Or even just different sites that you're working on in that space. The insights and improvements is then the other side, is sort of the other side of the spectrum that is quite important. And that's when, I guess, when I was, the best example was, and I always sort of use this example, when I was working in Sydney Trains, or I think at the time it was Railcorp. I think they change names all the time. Or Transport for New South Wales, one of the three. I remember a driver hopping off the train and basically going, and I was an engineer working in one of the centres, one of the reliability centres, and he parked the train. He basically just walks up and goes, "Mate, train's stuffed," and walks off. And now, where do you start with that? It's an 8-car train with, multiple bogies and all that, and you're like, okay, the train is stuck. Okay, cool. I find in the process space, you either enter into an improvement from two perspectives. One is either someone is suggesting an improvement that is, or suggesting a solution that you then need to challenge, would be the first one, or you really need to go back to the problem statement. The second side of it is often you get quite generic entries like the train is stuffed. So I've had a couple already in my time at Lion, where it's basically, this thing's broken, go fix it. And you're like, okay, that is really part of that process improvement skill set that you need to have, is bringing it back to, okay, now what is the actual problem that we're trying to fix? And that is very important in the process management space to understand. But to understand the problem you're trying to fix, you also need to have a clear understanding of the value stream and what customers that value stream is serving. And once you understand what customers that value stream is serving, and you understand what the value stream and the actual steps in the value stream are, it becomes much easier to start to then define what is the problem we're going to start to look at fixing. That's very much important. So always bringing it back to the problem. The value, I think, in the organisations is literally the value you can bring by solving those problems. So the organisations that are seeking standardisation will tend to go down the clarity and ownership side of things. The organisations that are seeking bottom line, effectively, or even top line growth, it's more around process improvement and problem statements, but do need to work together, because eventually what you do find is that at the end of your Lean Six Sigma cycle, there's a little thing called control, which is probably, I reckon, the worst implemented part of any Lean Six Sigma project. It's always the one that people forget. They go, "Oh, sweet, we implemented this amazing new system," and then they kind of walk away. The control part, to me, is where you bring it back to process management and go, how do we make sure this process does not decay long term? And if not even decay, but how do we make sure it doesn't continue to improve? And that's where the value of things like process mining is becoming very, very powerful because it's a very strong, robust mechanism to control and understand those sort of, it's almost like the new world statistical process control that can understand when your processes are decaying or not, and have, technological triggers that are telling you not, that they aren't as well. So process mining is becoming a very powerful tool in that space. I think it's still maturing. I think people are still trying to understand what it actually is and what it can do. But to me, that is a really powerful space in bringing it back to kind of that process management, because it's kind of I almost say it's like a GPS on your rugby players. I'm also a big sailor as well, so it's the GPS or the tracker on your boat. You know that you need to head in a particular direction. You just have to make sure, you are heading in that direction. And that's really kind of what process mining helps you do in that space, is in that process improvement space. So I think the value often comes from standardization or basically request to improve bottom or top line, and you need to show how process can do that because that's what the business cares about.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. And I think on process mining, it is a topic that a lot of our audience in particular have lots of questions around, and who's using it and who's putting it into practice. And I guess before we dive into that, because that is a question I do want to explore as well, do you have any sort of eye-opening, and maybe it'll tie into this question, but do you have any eye-opening moments of like significant BPM wins where not so much for you as the practitioner, but maybe for the wider business or for the senior leaders, where they're like, it's like a light bulb moment for them. They're like, I get why we need to do this now.
I guess for me, one of the big ones very much came, and probably one of the big value ones came when we were doing a bit of a shift in operating model for some of in some of the stores that I worked in previously. It always starts with an idea. Hang on, how about we flip the operating model to go one direction rather than the other? Work rather than departments. Let's work in value streams and make sure that people's roles are aligned with, rather than departments are aligned with value streams, et cetera, et cetera. And it kind of came when they approached me and they said, we need to start to really look at what are the tasks that each of these people do. And we found that when we flipped the model the way they intended to, there was probably around, now I kind of worked in hours, there was a significant number of hours and tasks that were then not attributable or anyone was really accountable for. So if you turn this model on and basically went, we're going to turn this model on because in theory it sounds really good, we were able to use business process management and some of the techniques and the fact that we'd mapped out all these processes to effectively say, if you turn that on, there is going to be X number of tasks that people have not been accountable or given clarity or ownership over. That's going to cause a lot of chaos. That was really powerful. And then allowing them to go back into the model and go, how do we set up this, even just organizational structure? How do we set up this structure such that everyone has clear accountability in terms of what their tasks are and everyone knows we can basically start to build these tasks into their role? That became very powerful, and then that flowed on to, okay, now we need to have clear days in the life of. We need to have very clear that we can start to give these people to say, so that they know when they start this new role, this is what we need to be able to do. These are the tasks we need to be able to do. So very much the light bulb moment and that clarity for the business came when they realised how process and even organisational structure aligned. And then even how process aligned with standardized work and labour standards, so wage spend as well. How do we know how much task each of these people are doing, and are they overloaded in their task? That really built some traction in the back end for people to go, actually, there's a lot of value in this kind of work now. There's a lot of value in understanding in depth what some of these processes are, and not just from a people and organisational structure side of things, but from a wage spend side of things, from a clarity and ownership side of things. That, to me, I think was a big light bulb moment for the business. I didn't enter it from a process management perspective. I didn't enter it saying I'm going to map all these processes. I literally entered it with a bit of a call for help from the business going, we need to understand how these roles are going to be impacted. And that little bit of analysis basically triggered this whole world of downstream work that then needed to be done in the process space to make sure that we were ready for that transition. That and from that I've now actually moved on from there, but that's now a significant sort of group of work that is being done in that space.
Yeah, great.
So I think that's probably a big. I think that's probably one of the bigger moments for me a bit later in the career, just in terms of that process management light bulb moment.
Yeah, great. That's good.
And I don't think I ever actually used the term business process management. I think I just used the tools and proved them.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. That's good. And you've touched on previously, obviously, the different stakeholders and individuals that you need to bring along for that journey.
Yep.
And I guess, speaking of not using the word business process management and speaking their language, talk to us about how do you get buy-in from the various stakeholders, because process obviously touches every area of an organization. You've got people on the front line that are part of the process, and then you've got senior leaders that have their strategic objectives that they're trying to, get done, utilizing the resources in the organization. So how do you get buy-in from, these key levels across the organization?
Know when to hold them, know when to fold them. I think one of the things is business process management isn't just there's a wealth of objectives in business process management, whether it be process improvement, process measurement, process clarity, process ownership. Understand what is actually important to the stakeholder at the time. Things like process management, you always see things like measurement as being super sexy. That's kind of a little bit of a carrot you can sometimes dangle because they go, I need better measurement. And then what you kind of see is that's like, your foot in the door that goes, okay, measurement, cool. In order to get the measurement right, we need to understand what our processes are in those documents. So really, really key to understand what's important to that stakeholder to get the foot in the door. And like I sort of said with the previous one, it was very much around we had a very clear understanding of the tasks that were done within a store. Someone came out and asked for help, and you saw how that became a business process management, effectively a business process management program. It just wasn't called that. Don't hold on to having to call it a business process management program. It could be called a workforce management program or something of the like. But it uses the same principles, tools, skill sets. I always joke about the fact that, the likes of Lean and Six Sigma are basically just consulting names over some practical tool set and delivery. So someone needs to be able to sell it and package it up, right? That's a lot of what this is, don't get stuck on the name and having to call it a business process management program and having to go document everything. Understand really what those stakeholders are interested in and what can bring value to the business based on the maturity of where they are. Now, some will already be very mature, and so they will be looking for a different approach or a different tool set than those that are extremely immature. And in fact, it's the extremely immature ones that are very difficult because the extremely immature ones, as I said before, often don't even understand what process is or means. They kind of see process as very stifling, and that's almost inherently why they're immature. And it's very much driven by heroics. So it's a single individual who knows how to do their job. Really where they feel the pain is when that individual's not there, because they'll generally get the job done and they'll do it quite well, but they feel the pain when something happens to that individual's not there. There's a change that happens in the organisation, a new system gets brought in. That's where they'll kind of generally feel the pain and throw a lot of stones in glass houses. So it's really about understanding which of these incredibly large tool set and which of these incredibly large principles best align with what are the strategic outcomes that they want to deliver. Then they'll start seeking. It opens up the door to a whole new world of process management don't, and I've failed with this before, don't go down the path where you just go, we have to go and document all these processes. And it's very important to document processes, and this is why you must value it. It just does not stay. People will smile and nod and accept that it's valuable, but then when you go, cool, I now need 300 resources for a year. Not that many. I'm just making shit up now. Well, I need this much resource to be able to actually go do it. That's kind of when you start to get the inklings in the sponsor that maybe they're not actually that keen and see the value in it. In that space. So there are a wealth of tools, whether it be measurement, process improvement, whether it just be delivering something small, a small process improvement project that they actually go, okay, I see the value in this. That's where business process management systems grow from. You're never going to win hearts and minds of those stakeholders just by shoving business process management theory down their throat. You've got to prove it first.
Yeah, definitely. And now diving into that topic of, I guess, the future of business process management, and you've already touched on a number of different topics there, like process mining and obviously there's a whole wide range of technology that's out there that I guess the real pioneering organizations are diving into. What does the next 2, 3, 5 years look like in the process management space? What trends are you noticing, and what do you think organizations really need to be focusing their attention on?
Cool. I think one thing I'd probably acknowledge first is that the principles of process management, like the things like outside-in thinking, customer first, understanding variation, Deming's principles of profound knowledge, all those sort of fun things are all very, still reasonably stable and still very valid in that space. In fact, a lot of them have been transformed into new, I'd say, university topics. So I often kind of think of the Deming wheel is now basically turned into design thinking. Kind of, there's very strong correlation in those two. So those principles, I think, will always be strong and still valid and apply. It's kind of like your personal integrity. You always have a very strong moral value that you maintain quite strictly through your life, but how that is manifested is going to start to look very different in that. I think what we're going to find is the advent of process mining and process automation is not necessarily going to replace, not going to go and go, we're going to go fully replace some of these, process mapping tools and et cetera, but which some people think it will. I think it's going to be a very strong substitution. It's going to be a very strong tool that you can use at your disposal. But once again, if the only tool you had was a hammer, you couldn't build a house. It'll be a very strong tool to use in assisting in really accelerating some of these insights that we can get through business process management practice. Robotic process automation, once again, as well, is a similar tool as well that is going to be used to help accelerate some of the inefficiencies in process, to eliminate a lot of the transactional work that goes on and may remove some of, we often have a very, very strong dependency on IT builds and bits and pieces like that in the process space, remove some of that dependency and make it a bit more self-service. I think the relationship between process management and data is critical. Process management and data need to be in bed together in any organization. The ability to ask questions and validate root causes rapidly is very powerful. A really good example would be back in stores days, where a lot of people have very strong, and we had a measure of efficiency of stores. A lot of people had a very strong opinion as to what are the key factors that influence the efficiency of the stores. And what you could effectively do with this really strong amount of data is for those nerds out there, like a basic multivariate linear regression analysis, and go, actually, out of all these factors, these are the two most influential. These are the two most influential factors on the efficiency of the store. The insights you get back to feed that back to process is incredibly powerful. So I think what, to me, the growth in process improvement is the relationship between process and your data and insights team, if you've got a data and insights team. But the relationship and the access to the data and the insights, process mining straddles the two as well. So it's very important in terms of how it sort of straddles the two. Often it sits with data and insights, sometimes it sits with the process team. Very, very critical in the relationship that those two have in that space. But once again, it is a very powerful tool that you can then use to gather quick insights into your processes. Also, I think, as I mentioned before, the use of process mining for things like alternatives to your traditional control charts and statistical process control, because they can provide a lot more depth in terms of non-compliance paths and all that kind of fun thing. Apologies. That's very powerful. And then robotic process automation is very much around it's about some of those solutions that you can bring in place. I wouldn't say it's always the best solution. I think when you're coming up with solutions, it's all about what level of process control do you want to put in. An example, like traffic lights on the street, you can have a stop sign that says, please don't drive here. It's not going to stop you going through, but you're not going to build a bridge and a tunnel for the expense that's required to cross that intersection. But they ultimately achieve the same thing. A bridge and a tunnel is all about going through an intersection. A set of traffic lights is all about going through an intersection. A stop sign is about going through an intersection. So you need to pick what level of control is appropriate. Process automation is very powerful at the moment in that it allows you to go towards building that bridge in the tunnel, setting a very robust, difficult to fail mechanism. So I think in Lean they call it kind of poka-yoke, where it will basically, automation allows you to do that. But if you built the bridge wrong, you're never going to go in the right direction. But it does straddle the two, because you don't have to go through these massive software implementations to make any sort of hard engineered solutions. But sometimes an administrative control or visual management is just as powerful because it allows you to be a bit more nimble and flexible, but it doesn't have that element of control. So I think there's probably some insights and where I'm going. I think there's definitely improvements happening in that process mining space with a lot of even data and machine learning, where it starts to, rather than you having to hunt the insights, it starts to tell you the insights. That itself is also very powerful in where the process space will go. So I think we're going to see a very strong merging of data analytics and insights and process into the future in that process improvement space specifically.
Yeah, great. That's amazing. That's fantastic. Well, Ben, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me today. We've obviously been able to dive into a range of different topics, and I've certainly been taking a ton of notes myself, and I'm sure the audience would have as well. So I guess if because we can only fit so much or so little into 40-minute conversation. If the audience does have follow-up questions for you, or that maybe you've piqued an interest in them and they've got a burning question that we weren't able to sort of tackle today, how can they get in touch with you? Can they get in touch?
Yeah, they can get in touch. I think the easiest way for me is the LinkedIn space. It's probably the easiest way from a professional networking space. I'm more than comfortable and happy to always looking at building out my sort of professional process network. So feel free to reach out that. Just mention Daniel's podcast, and that way you'll pique my interest, so it's not just spam coming through, which I know we all get. Mention that. I'm free to sort of have a conversation. I'm in Sydney if anyone wants to come down and just even have a half-hour coffee catch up and a brain knowledge picking. I think transparency in the space and learning is very important. It's not a competition. And I myself, still being young, still learning, I think this space is accelerating incredibly quickly. I can probably say to you, I'm not as on top of RPA and mining as I should be. I'm on top of what it can provide, and and how it works. But that's something that I'm also very interested in understanding what it can do for us.
No, that's great. Well, Ben, again, thank you so much. It's been, I guess, from my side, from the Process Pioneers community, it's been an absolute privilege.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for letting me talk about myself for a while. It's always a nice thing to do.